That's problem number one, is you don't lead with technology. You never lead with technology. That's probably one of the top 3 reasons for failure.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with various industry practitioners or process practitioners, those that are putting the power of process management into practice day in and day out across a wide range of organizations. I had the privilege of sitting down with those that are coming from an academic lens and talking about innovation and the future and trends that they're noticing. I also get the privilege of sitting down with consultants that work with a wide range of organizations and really go deep into solving their problems or helping them to solve their problems. So in today's episode, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Tony Benedict. Now, Tony is the president and director of ABPMP. If you're a part of the association, then you may be familiar with Tony already. And he's also a management consultant leading major transformations, again, across a large range of organizations. So I'm very excited for this conversation. Tony, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on your podcast, Daniel.
So one question that the audience is eager to know is, how did you get into this topic, into this world of business process management? Is it something that you were formally trained in or qualified in, or did you somehow stumble into the industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say it's probably more so of stumbling into it. It started about 25 years ago, actually, when I started working for Intel Corporation. And we were transitioning from one product to another, which happened at Intel usually every 18 months. And what was different from a market perspective, and this is important to put into context, many people are familiar with AMD. Well, AMD came out with a very low-end, low-priced microprocessor. And our CEO at the time, Andy Grove, I would say he freaked out and said, we have to do something. And so we ended up changing our form factor. So what does that mean? Basically means that when you take a circuit board and a chip and attach it, the chip to the circuit board with gold wire, that's a processor. What we ended up doing was creating a full cartridge. It was probably about maybe 6 inches long, maybe about a ½ inch deep, and about 3 inches wide. And it had 127 piece parts on the bill of material, which the previous microprocessors had less than 5.
Wow.
So in essence, what we ended up doing is we started a whole new group at Intel. And I would call this a startup group, right? There was 4 people. There was 2 engineers and 2 commercial people, me being one of them. And the engineering folks were the liaison to the design engineers. And then we were the liaison to the suppliers who really needed to be certified to start manufacturing essentially the circuit board that would go into the cartridge, and then the cartridge itself, all the passives, all the heat sinks, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was in the substrate group. So we were the largest spend, and we were the most complicated because we'd never done anything like this before. And so essentially, we went from 4 people to about 150 people within 6 months. And we didn't have what I would call any process, let alone standard processes for doing the supply chain planning, taking a production plan and going from master production schedule to each production plan at 6 facilities, which was a lot of facilities at that time. And so that was my initial orientation to process, because we had to really start with nothing and put something in place that was standard. Intel had and still does have a philosophy of what they call copy exactly, where every factory is a carbon copy of every other, whether it's assembly test or it's the fab environment. And so whatever we did, it was one process for 6 facilities. So we had to hire buyers that were going to do inventory management locally, do kitting locally, et cetera. And so when you're in a supply chain organization, I will say that by default, you have to know what process is. You have to be very oriented to it. You also learn project management very, very quickly. And that was what I would call my original schooling in business process. And it really just evolved from there. We had to put in a old IBM mainframe system to do MRP, which was very interesting. If you've ever seen an old IBM mainframe, they're black computer screens with green print, and it's almost like they're keystrokes. There aren't even DOS commands, and using a mouse is it hasn't been invented yet in the mainframe world. It is now, but back then it wasn't. And then as you start out doing what's called low volume manufacturing, you'll do 50,000 units a week, then 100,000 units a week, then 150,000 units. And the engineering quality people are trying to make sure that all the manufacturing processes are stable so that there's basically 0 defects, or what Six Sigma people call 6 nines, right? You want to get to 6 nines in low volume manufacturing, and then you transfer to what they call high volume. So you go from a small assembly test facility, which we had here in Arizona, and transferred it to the 6 facilities in Costa Rica, Ireland, the Philippines, Malaysia, et cetera. And then you go from 150,000 units a week, eventually to about 2 million units a week. So you're doing between 100 and 200 million units a year. And all those units are supplying the entire PC industry globally, right? So that's quite a scaling that needs to happen from a process point of view. So we did that, and then that led to moving to a different group and doing business process for all the other groups. And we implemented SAP prior to me leaving and doing the business process side. And then I was asked to at that time, Andy, we were going through year 2000, which probably is a distant thought in a lot of people's minds, but everybody was paranoid that all the computer systems would, shut down, December 31st at, 11:59 p.m. So Andy Grove said, well, we need to document all of our processes if all the computer systems go down. We did all that. We implemented SAP. We went live in the new millennium, if you will. And that led to doing more process work. And then I was asked there was 8 of us that were asked to join a new group called the e-business group. And so we did all the supplier-facing processes for the company. And there was a customer-facing sister group that did the same thing we did. And as that progressed, we started developing enterprise architecture business, and I was the lead business architect and developed business architecture at Intel, and really started getting more serious about it beyond just reading all the books that were out there at that time, and went to a conference. And that's how I met our prior president, Brett Champlin. And I said, look, I've got this group of 8 people. I know how to do business process. I might not be, the leading expert in the world, but I said, I know how to do it. And I'm wondering if there's a body of knowledge, a certification where I could just kind of take that and train my staff. And he said, no, why don't you join and we'll put one together? And that's how I got into ABPMP in 2003. And so 6 years later, we had our first version and we put it out for feedback, got a lot of feedback globally from practitioners, academicians, et cetera. And we took all that feedback, took almost another year and consolidated all of it into version 2 and published officially in 2009. So from 2003 to 2009, it took that long to really drive consensus on what is BPM. Because I think and you still have a lot of people that'll debate this, but essentially there's a lot of definitions. Most of the definitions you see out there are from software companies. They give you the definition that puts it into the context of their software as opposed to what it really is, which is a very large umbrella of a management discipline. And so we had a lot of people that said, well, my way is the best way. So everybody was focused on how and methodology. And we sort of walked everybody back and said, well, let's say, what is it first? What are all the knowledge areas? What comprises business process management? And let's start there. Then we can get into common practices, methodologies, et cetera, et cetera. And once we were able to gain consensus on that approach, then it went fairly quickly. And so that's how I was one of the founding board members of ABPMP. That's how the business process management common body of knowledge was developed. After we launched that, we developed our first certification. We have 2, soon to be 3 now. And we're on our 4th version of the body of knowledge. That's sort of 25 years in about 4 or 5 minutes.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that, Tony. That's really interesting. I'm curious about that time between 2003 to 2009. So you're putting together this body of knowledge. You're as you're saying, you're catching up with all of these different industry professionals and practitioners and academicians, which is a new word for me, but I like
academics. Yeah, a friend of mine turned me on to that word, so I try to use it to keep it fresh. It's an academic. It's an academic.
Yeah, no, I like it. And so you would have seen a lot of examples of what maybe good BPM adoption looks like and maybe what poor BPM adoption looks like. What does, and you're saying there that, a lot of people have different sort of opinions around what is BPM, but what does successful BPM look like? How do you know that you are doing it well and it is actually doing what you set out to achieve?
Sure. I think that's a great question. And keep in mind that when we first started out, we had ideas about what BPM was. And once you know the knowledge areas, you could start working on the common practices. And what we tried to do, and it was very hard, that's why it took 6 years, was focus on what works 70% or greater of the time you do it. So I may say, hey, I've got this methodology and, I've used it 4 times and it's worked, 4 times. Okay. 4 times is not a lot. So when you get to practices for the knowledge areas, there's process modeling, process analysis, process design, process transformation, process organization. That's what does an organization that does BPM do? There's a technology side, which is, very broad at this point. There's enterprise process management, which is the governance side. You kind of get the idea. So you have all these knowledge areas, and there's common practices in each. And so in the body of knowledge, you have all those practices where we know from all the practitioners that have provided input into the body of knowledge that when you do these practices, you're going to be successful 70% or more of the time you utilize it. And so every year we revisit those practices, and every 2 to 3 years, if there's something that needs to be revised, we'll come out with a revision to the body of knowledge. And so process modeling, not a lot of new stuff there, quite frankly. I would say it's been very stable between, let's say, version 3 and version 4. Process analysis, a little bit, not a lot, fairly stable. Process design has taken on a new meaning. And so we really tried to bring design principles into the process design knowledge area and chapter. And then, you look at a process transformation and just defining what it is. So you have process transformation, which from our point of view, meaning ABPMP, that's business transformation. And you hear a lot of people talk about digital transformation, which is really just business transformation with technology augmentation. But we have 3 clear definitions in the body of knowledge on what we believe it is. We took it from the Harvard Business Review. I can't remember what professor. And we clearly state these are the 3 types. And these are examples of what those types are. So we're very clear on that. So we added a lot more in that section. And when you read that section, then you start understanding what the practices are because we start laying them out. And so when it comes to doing BPM, there's 10 critical elements that need to be integrated into your overall approach. We could talk about them throughout the rest of the podcast if you want, but you can't sit there and just say there's 3 things that constitute what makes BPM successful, because there aren't. I would say there's at least 10 critical capability elements, and those capability elements have to be done together. There's strategy, there's location, there's organization, there's technology, there's process, there's data, there's human capability, which is sort of the HR side of it, skills, competencies. There's the organizational side, which is how do you structure organizations to be high performing. And wrapped either all around that or at the center of that is culture, which is probably the most complicated element that plays into the integration of the other 10.
Yeah, right. No, that's really interesting. So I'd imagine when adopting BPM, and because I've seen organizations that they'll adopt this approach, but it'll be fleeting. It won't be sustainable. It doesn't have longevity. It maybe comes in and lasts for 2-3 years, senior leadership change, then there's a new approach. So I'd imagine based on those critical elements, having that culture, that is so important for creating that sustainable BPM. Well, I guess all of them, all of those elements are critical for having that sustainable BPM. Why do you think some organizations do see it last between, various changes in leadership, and other organizations, it never seems to quite penetrate the organization enterprise-wide. It stays, the approach, or the management approach stays in pockets of the organization, but is never fully realizes the full potential that it could have.
That's a great question. And again, I don't think there's any one particular answer. There's several answers. I will say this. The failure rate is still about 70%. So if you just take digital transformation, and there's way too many definitions out there, as I mentioned earlier, most of them are definitions from technology companies pushing their software. That's problem number one, is you don't lead with technology. You never lead with technology. That's probably one of the top 3 reasons for failure. Part of that problem, if you can imagine, is leadership, right? They think, okay, what software do we need to solve this problem? Go find it and just let's put it in and let's get this thing solved. Like it's just some simple project, that might be reconciled within 3 to 6 months. So there's a leadership problem there, where they're not really oriented to the process itself, or which process. They may not even know what process. The CEO may have a mental model that's different than the, chief commercial officer, for example. So there's that. There's a leadership orientation. There's strategic alignment. What I found over the course of my career, and it's shocking, actually, very, very shocking, is that many companies, and I don't really, point to any particular size company. You could be a family business, small business. You could be a middle market, anywhere from 100 million to, let's say, 2 billion in revenue, or you could be in the Fortune 2000, 1,500, Fortune 50. I'm shocked at the number of companies that do not have well thought out, well documented strategic plans. If you don't have that, what are you aligning to? What are you aligning the whole organization to? What's the bar of performance if you don't know what that strategy, the strategic plan is? And from there, obviously, you have an operational plan that says this is what we have to do to realize this strategy. So that to me is still shocking after all these years. So leading with technology as a strategy, leadership just not being clued in on what's really important around process. And the third, to me, as I mentioned, is strategic alignment. I think those are 3 big ones. The other is, and this is probably tying to leadership as well. You can't have a functional area leader lead an effort that's cross-functional in nature without involving those other executives. For example, you can't have the CIO say, well, hey, we're going to do digital transformation, and not talk to let's say, the supply chain executive or the chief sales executive or the chief marketing executive. You get the idea. It has to be, and this is what I have to say. I learned it very, very well at Intel. I've yet to see a company, and not to say that Intel is still does it to the extent they did it when Andy Grove was CEO. I don't think they do anymore. By the time I left there, I know they weren't. We used to have 10-year strategic plans. Imagine that, 10 years. How many fabs are you going to build? What's the product roadmap look like? How many times you're going to shrink the die? down to how many nanometers. They're down to 5 nanometers now. Most companies, a 5-year plan is a stretch. A 3-year plan would be very welcome. If they even did a 1-year plan, it'd be amazing. So my point is that Andy Grove was very adamant about doing a strategic plan every year, and it cascaded down through all the layers of management down to frontline staff. Everybody knew what the strategy was. And then operational plans were, the major operational plan was pretty straightforward. And then your department had to align to that operational plan. And so that whole strategic alignment that came literally from a tops-down perspective is ideal. Does it happen a lot? Probably not. I would say I would be surprised if 50% of the companies on the planet do it that way. But the other thing is, not many companies like Intel started in 1971 or 2 and became a $70 billion a year company in a matter of about 30, 40 years. So, the GEs of the world and the Coca-Colas of the world and the Walmarts of the world. Well, Walmart's probably a good example like Intel, but you get the idea. Your big companies like, Exxon Mobil and General Electric, it took them 100 years to kind of be who they are. So my point in elaborating on this is that leadership is very critical, and leaders who get it, they have to understand the business side. They have to understand that there is technology, and it should be tops down, but cross-functionally tops down, not just one functional department. And so that's another important thing. That's why those 10 capability elements really touch every functional organization in the enterprise.
Yeah. Now, if we got a lot of people listening to this podcast that are working within an organization, and some, I guess, are in a position where their senior leadership is already on board, and not just an individual, but across the team. And then there are many other organizations where there may be buy-in from one of the executives. That there may be very little buy-in at all, but they've been brought into the organization maybe on a project level or something like that. But how do you, I guess, as practitioners that working internally at our organizations, how do we drive that buy-in and adoption? We've obviously been talking about how important it is to bring the senior leadership on the journey. So let's start there, because obviously process touches every area. So there are many people, many stakeholders we need to bring along for the journey. But how do we, I guess, make progress with bringing senior leadership along that journey? Or is it too much of a battle to, worth spending time on?
I think you mentioned one operative word there. It is a journey. It's not a project. That philosophically is something that takes time for senior executives to understand. However, the shortcut that I believe exists, and you have to approach it a certain way to really make it an effective shortcut, is you find out each executive and what they're measured on. So senior executives, whatever, executive vice presidents, chief operating officers, as senior vice president, EVP, whatever that executive level is, they all get bonuses. And the people that work for them get bonuses. What are they measured on? You have to find that out. And it doesn't take long. It really doesn't. And again, if there's an operational plan, it's all there, right? Salespeople, it's X increases in revenue on these products, et cetera. supply chain people, it's this amount of cost reduction, profit margin. You get the idea. So when you look at how people are measured, you can basically tie all of it together with one or two core measurements that'll work at the whole enterprise level for the whole company. So it could be top line growth and profit, which is EBITDA, if you're so inclined to use the financial terms. And once you get that, then knowing how to have those conversations with the other executives, getting them all in the same room, then they'll start connecting the dots, and you'll help them connect the dots in that performance conversation. Because at the end of the day, it's really about performance. It's individual performance, it's company performance, and in between the company and the individual is the process. And if you're a process person, you'll know how to connect the measurement from the company and the individual to the process. And that's the key alignment. And so a good practitioner knows how to do that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was reading a book the other day. I can't actually think of who it was by now, but it was talking about how our senior executives deploy their strategic objectives across the organization. A large bank may have anywhere from 50,000 employees, 100,000 employees plus. So how do they move this such a large beast of so many moving parts in one cohesive, in unison with one another, so that they're all working together towards that same goal. And this, I believe he was a consultant as well, but he's talking about how important process is from deploying that strategic objectives and actually get the cogs moving and the wheels turning all in the same direction. And I think that's so important. But you were saying at the start of our conversation, you were telling us about your time at Intel. And the need for understanding processes there, and going from certain number, I think it was 100,000, 150,000 chips every week being manufactured, all the way to 2 million chips being produced. Do you have some other wins or examples or case studies that you can share with us around how maybe you're working with an organization in adopting BPM and it delivered significant value to what they were doing?
Sure. This is when I moved out of sort of the pure supply chain and went into the e-business group. And so Andy Grove, again, this is back when the internet was still kind of whiz-bangy and cool, and it wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now, where it's on your phone and et cetera. Andy basically said, we need to do all of our business over the internet. So every time we sell chips, we should sell over the internet to our customers. Every time we buy raw materials, we should do it over the internet. So I was spearheading the supplier-facing side of it, and there was another person doing the customer side. Well, the customer side was, I don't want to say, it was easier to do because, well, and even now, you have what, three PC makers. You have HP, Dell, and probably IBM sold to a Chinese company, and there's probably maybe four or five companies globally, right? At that time, there was HP, Compaq, Dell, Acer. I mean, there was a bigger list, but you're really only dealing with, let's say, maybe a dozen PC companies globally. So it's kind of easier to implement things with 10 customers than it is to implement with, let's say, 10,000 suppliers. All right. That was our dilemma. So we had the whole procure to pay, right? I'm going to send you a requisition. You're going to accept that, yes, I can ship this product of this date in this quantity. You confirm it, right? That whole process. And there was direct materials and there was indirect. So direct is what goes into the product you sell. Indirect is everything else.
Mm-hmm.
We used to say it's toilet paper and everything else. We used to tease those people, but it's, it's spare parts for equipment. It's all the things that don't go into your final product.
Mm.
And so when you looked at all that, I think we had between 10 and 15,000 suppliers. And, the first dilemma is you're doing procure to pay. The good news is we had a direct system, SAP for direct, and for indirect, we still were working on we still had a homegrown system. We didn't do SAP yet. Mm. So there's only 2 systems for procure to pay. That was kind of the good news. The bad news was, what's the capability of your suppliers to transact with you over the internet? And what does over the internet really mean?
Mm.
So that time, people were thinking, well, gee, we could just put up a web page. They go to the web page and do everything there. Well, okay, that's part of it, but that web page has to connect to your back-end system, your SAP, and in this case, the indirect system I think it was called Rapid. Mm-hmm. So even though if you have a web front end, you have to connect to the back end system. So there was creating standard processes for the indirect people because they didn't have them. We did in direct materials because I was part of doing all that. But for indirect materials, we didn't have standard processes. We had to get them on a standard process. That was job number 1. Once we got them on a standard process, then we could start looking at capability levels. So we created 3 capability levels. We were doing EDI, faxing. We were faxing purchase orders all over the planet. Imagine what the phone bill is for that. International fax numbers, right? And that was it. We were EDI, we were fax, or we were email, right? They didn't have a fax machine. Some, believe it or not, some did. We were emailing it. So then, you go through the level of capability, you figure out, well, who can accept an electronic purchase order on the supplier side into their system? So if I send it to you electronically, can you accept it and download it right into your system, your ERP system, or whatever you're using? And so we started segmenting our supply base by those capabilities. And, it's Pareto's rule, 80-20. So 80% of our high dollar volume business was with 20% of the suppliers who actually had decent capability. So we worked with them to end of life EDI. We went to business using RosettaNet at that time, which was an XML technology. Keep in mind, this is 20 some years ago. And we got each transaction. So a purchase order, an invoice, and advanced shipping notice, they were transactions in SAP. We got the cost of that down to $100 from like a couple thousand. So we made it very inexpensive for our suppliers to do it. And then for faxing, what we did is we created, we ended up calling it Web Suite. We had purchase order, invoice, and advanced shipping notice. And every time we created a purchase order in SAP, it would go out, it would send them an email. They would click on the link, they would get to the website, they'd log in, they could get the PO and download it into their system directly. or they could print it out, whatever they were going to do on their end. Then when they were ready to ship, they could take that PO, click on an ASN button, and everything on the PO would repopulate to the ASN except the waybill number. They had to put the waybill number in that would tell us the carrier, basically to track your shipment. You guys probably have that. Your carriers in Australia probably have that. UPS, our postal service does it now here. So there was that. And then when we received the product, they would, again, bring the PO up. They could click on invoice and the PO would populate. And if the quantity matched, the quantity on the PO matched the quantity received, it was a 1-to-1. And all they would do is submit the invoice. If there was a quantity discrepancy, our buyers would intervene and change the quantity on the PO so that when it came up, when they clicked on the PO to invoice it, the received quantity would reflect that. So, it was that level of detail. So long story short, we did all this in a year and we put about $17 billion worth of direct and indirect materials, either on, at that time, we called it RosettaNet XML or WebSuite. And we eliminated faxing, we eliminated EDI, we saved, a couple $1 million a year just getting rid of those things. And we were 100% electronic for all of our supplier-facing processes and the transactions that would reflect in your ERP system. So we were able to buy, pay, track shipments, et cetera. The indirect side was a little bit more complicated, but once we got standard processes, the WebSuite, I think almost 99% of the supply base on the indirect side was on WebSuite. None of them had capability to do RosettaNet XML or any of that. But it worked out. We did that fairly quickly. Like I said, in a year. And Andy Grove went out and talked at conferences about it. That's how excited he was about it. But here is the point. How did we get all these people from frontline staff all the way to executives to buy into this? Well, at Intel, everybody gets a bonus. Everybody. So the bonus for the supplier-facing people was contingent on us getting 100% of our purchases on the internet. And anything we did to save money was a bonus on top of that. So convincing people that we needed to do this wasn't very difficult because everybody wants their bonus at the end of the year. And everybody got their bonus at the end of the year. And we did it. We finished a month early. It took us 11 months to do all this.
Yeah, right.
People were just energized, excited, et cetera. So again, I think that whole idea of performance, how are you measured? What even your performance review is, what are you measured on? You're measured on your own performance. And if you're bonused on that, then getting people to buy in is pretty straightforward. That's been my experience. And I can say that in every company I've either worked for or consulted with, that's I think a best practice for really getting people to buy in and aligned on BPM initiatives. Now, again, the important thing to note here is, even though we did that in less than a year, people viewed it as a project. Right. So at Intel, we evolved the group to become more of a process-oriented center of excellence, et cetera. So there's more context that goes with what we did. But when you get wins like that, it's not difficult to convince executives what the next step is, because they'll say, what are we supposed to do next?
Mm-hmm.
You have to have the answer to that question. And so as we were evolving the BPM practice at Intel, it was kind of logical to move from what we were doing at a project level to what we really needed to do to be stewards of our own processes. And again, it wasn't difficult to convince people at that point, because executives at that point, they expected it.
Yeah. No, that's really good. So that's, I guess now taking all of that history that you've been sharing with us, and obviously the great wins that you've experienced and been a part of, when we look towards the future of BPM now, and there's a lot of, I feel like there's a lot of exciting technology that's in this space at the moment, that's popped up over the last, it hasn't popped up, it's been many years of sort of a work in progress, but we've got technologies like process mining, data mining, task mining, we've got robotic process automation, all of these different automation technologies. What sort of trends are you noticing in the process management space, and what do you think the next 2, 3, 5 years will look like? Obviously, we're always going to have that diverse spread of process maturity, those organizations that are really leading the way, and those organizations that maybe are resisting or falling behind. But what would you say the next 2, 3, 5 years are going to look like?
So I would say the first thing is that there's a huge resurgence in general interest and, more importantly, focus on business process management as a management discipline. There's a lot of organizations, and even the technology companies are starting to realize that you can't lead with the technology. So there's a resurgence in the focus on BPM as a management discipline, number one. Number two, I don't like the word use case, but the business cases for the technology are becoming clearer than they were, let's say, 5 years ago. And most companies of a certain size will have an ERP system because you need one. You need one to do your income statement, your balance sheet, log all your transactions, house one data model for everything you do. However, when the competitive environment changes, going in and changing ERP is not something anybody wants to do anymore. So the BPM software has become more of a platform now. It started out as modeling, simulation, then they got into analysis, they added rules engines. Now they have all the things you mentioned: process mining, RPA, hyperautomation. There's repositories with huge databases for very robust analytics, et cetera. Now those platforms can sit on top of ERP, and you can essentially modify processes on the fly using the BPM platform without touching your back-end ERP system. That was unheard of 10 years ago. Well, I shouldn't say 10, I'd say definitely 15. 10 years ago, the companies that really had the vision started exploring that. Now it's a given. I mean, that's what you can do. And so I think that's where you're going to see a lot of the technology side. And so all of the, in the process world, the non-value added, task-oriented work can be automated as long as you've got a standard repeatable process. You can create bots galore. And there's companies that are doing that. very large companies that are doing that. And they have 20, 30, 40 bots already implemented on the repeatable processes that are viewed as more menial work. And it frees people up to do more value-added, more intellectually stimulating type work. And so that is a trend. I think you'll see that's going to really explode. And it's going to go beyond just what I would consider the Fortune 100, 500. It'll work its way down to the middle market companies. That's a process that's going to take 5-10 years till it becomes ubiquitous, like the internet became ubiquitous. That's a trend I think that will not go away. I think that the trend of BPM resurging as a management discipline won't go away, because people realize now, if you don't get process, the technology means nothing. You have to have people who understand it, are stewards of their processes, because it's all about the performance. It's the performance of the process that ties the individual to the process and ties the process to the organization and the process to the overall strategy.
Yeah.
And so that part of it is a big part of it, and which is why we, ABPMP, feel like we're developing an executive level certification for that reason. Because executives really need to be able to do that alignment between the process, the individual, frontline individuals, the organization, meaning the company as a whole, and then the whole strategic alignment to the corporate strategy. And so that to me was lacking. That's why we're coming up with another certification specifically for senior executives for that reason. That's a trend. We're going to meet that trend with another certification. So those are three big ones in my mind. I do think you're going to see a lot more application of machine learning and AI. I'm a little concerned about that, because a lot of the pilots that are going on out there are pilots that the organization isn't ready for, the profession that they're doing it in isn't ready for. However, they've had some decent success in, for example, radiology, where they're showing that AI can diagnose cancer cells faster than a radiologist, for example. That doesn't make radiologists very happy. Those guys make big bucks. That's a whole other conversation. My concern is that they're trying to do things in, let's say, the self-driving space where, and this is just observation, not opinion. There's been a lot of accidents with self-driving vehicles because people think, the software can just drive the car. I've seen videos on YouTube of people sleeping in the back seat while the car's driving. And you've seen the accidents out there where people were asleep at the wheel, if you will, and they weren't able to react. I mean, you have to be very careful where you use machine learning and AI and things like that. However, I do think there's a great future, provided it's done in a practical manner for the good of whatever they're trying to accomplish, not for using it for war and things like that. And don't want to give an opinion, but why is it even needed for that? How many different ways can you kill another person? Do you need an AI for that? Probably not. Anyway, don't want to go there. So I think there's room for that to really add a lot of value, provided that there's good focus and it's done in a way that makes it practical, where you have good outcomes, and you're not playing around with people's lives. Like the self-driving example to me is people are playing around with their own lives, and people have died because of it. So
yeah. No, it is a very exciting and interesting world that we're heading into, and I'm sure, give it another 20 years time, and we're going to be talking about things that can't even comprehend right now. So it's going to be an interesting future.
Who knows? Yeah, we may have we may have anti-gravity vehicles by that time, and being able to fly from point A to point B without a pilot, right?
Yeah.
Who knows? 30 years from now, who knows?
That's right. Yeah. So obviously, over the last sort of 55 minutes, we're only able to sort of touch on a number of topics when it comes to business process management, but I'm sure that you've piqued a lot of interest in our audience, maybe for those that are learning about BPM for the first time, or maybe it's a newer or newish concept to them, or maybe they're in an organization where they don't have a very large process maturity. For these people in particular, where would you advise they go for them to continue this learning, continue to understand what BPM can do for them, not only understand what it can do, but how to practically adopt it and embed it into their organization? Where would you recommend they go?
Sure. Obviously, I have a particular bias to the ABPMP website, primarily because it's the only place you can go where there's actually a body of knowledge. And there's 2, soon to be 3 certifications that say these are the skills, competencies, knowledge areas you should know to be proficient as a practitioner. There's no other place out there where you can find that. ABPMP.org. That I would say do that. There's a lot of good books out there. The best book, in my humble opinion, the one I read that I still actually use as a reference today, it's called Improving Performance: How to Manage the White Space Between Organizations. It was published in 1995 by Alan Braish and Gary Rumler. I knew Gary Rumler. I brought him into Intel. He is the guru as far as I'm concerned. He's the guy that told Mike Hammer how to do it. Everybody knows who Mike Hammer is, or was. He passed away a few years back. It's probably the best book that talks about the 3 levels of performance: the organization, process, the individual. Organizations as performance systems and human performance systems and measurement. There's no other books out there that really get into it at that level of detail. We cite him a lot in the body of knowledge, or cite that book, or the principles in our body of knowledge based on that. But that they did it before Gary passed away. They did an update on that version. The original was 95. There's another version that came out in the early 2000s, like 2005, 2006, something like that. I have both versions. I would highly recommend getting at least one of them. Preferably, you can get the newest one because it should have all the stuff from the original. And then, if this is going to be your passion in life and what you want to do as a profession, then I would say get certified. If you're just working on a project and you want to know everything about it so that you can be on a team and participate and understand the vernacular, be somewhat competent, you can buy the body of knowledge and just read through it. If you're a member, it's free. You can download the PDF. But if you really want to be, I started this way back when and made it a profession. And I have no regrets in terms of doing that. And I've been a frontline person. I've been a project manager. I've worked in supply chain. I've worked in operations. I've worked in high tech, pharmaceutical, medical device, healthcare, multiple industries. I've been an employee and I've been a consultant. And the skill set works everywhere across the board. So as a profession, it's worth investing in yourself to become a member and get certified and really go out and be passionate and do it.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. That's great. Well, if you are listening to this, please jump on the abpmp.org website and have a look at their certifications there. And obviously, if you've got any follow-up questions from this conversation, please reach out to Tony. I think probably best on LinkedIn. Tony, would you say?
Or president@abpmp.org.
Fantastic. That's great.
It's also on the website, I think, under About Us, you could see board of directors. I think my email's up there.
Great.
No spam, no spam, please. No spam.
No spam. But yeah, if you do have any follow-up questions for Tony, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm sure he'd love to be able to answer those for you. But Tony, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me today. I gleaned a lot from our conversation. I'm, furiously typing out notes here, trying to keep up, and I'm sure the audience has gleaned a lot from the conversation as well. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute privilege.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. Be happy to come back anytime and discuss any kind of topics related to it. Thank you.